Archives for Everyone, the strategy recently launched by the National Archives UK, places at its heart the vision that within the next 5 years, the institution will become the 21st century National Archive, the living, growing home of our national story. Now, the stated ambition is to connect with the biggest and most diverse audience possible in the most innovative ways. Now, to achieve this, Archives for Everyone is underpinned by 3 guiding principles: the need to be inclusive, entrepreneurial, and disruptive. Now, the first 2, self-explanatory. The latter is explained thus. Now, much of this disruption is predicated on contemporary archival conundra of ensuring the creation, capture, and long-term preservation of born digital records, and the need to maintain and generate access to historic and future collections in ways that meet the myriad needs of multiple audiences. Now, indeed, TNA's digital strategy insists that, and I quote, "the whole of the National Archives needs to be digital by instinct and design." Now, this is obviously unquestionably positive and chimes with many of the contributions to the conference. Now, but the extent to which this relates to the vast pre-modern collections at TNA, many of which remain practically beyond view, is more debatable. Now, this evening, then, I want to take my cue from Archives for Everyone and offer some personal, some might say disruptive reflections from an archive professional with a medievalist background on the future of the UK's largest medieval archive in the digital age, where presentation is paramount and where the imperatives towards digital obscure the realities of the volume and nature of medieval records in our care. Now, in so doing, it's not my intention to attempt some kind of Luddite counter-revolution against the digital. So I'm currently co-investigator of an AHRC-funded research project to examine the political and spiritual leadership of the Archbishops of York in the 14th century by digitising and digitally indexing their registers held at the Borthwick Institute in York and relevant ecclesiastical records at TNA. Previously, I was part of the research team which produced a digital edition of the Fine Rolls of King Henry III, the records held at TNA, of offers made to the Crown in return for favour. Now, both projects successfully used IIIF, TEI and ontological approaches to presentation and description. What instead I want to reinforce are some of the practical considerations within this rapidly evolving archival landscape. Now, these relate in the particular context of TNA, and to some extent the wider archive sector, to the industrial quantities of material that remain to be sorted before they can realistically be exposed to digital access methods, pressures on budgets, dwindling staff resources and specialist knowledge, all of which are impacted by the mission to be digital by design. See, I told you this wasn't there for a minute. Now, similarly, much that remains completely unread or on the fringes, though fundamentals of an understanding of administrative and legal process, may not attract the resource needed to bring it to brighter light due to its formulaic nature and the difficulties of condition, language, and technical terminology. Moreover, simply because we can see a moment where the entire archive could be readable, that doesn't mean we can fully understand it in context. And that presents a whole new set of problems, particularly as both archival and student training moves away from what we might call traditional archival skills. So I therefore also want to probe not only at the feasibility, but the desirability and utility of the current approach, and suggest that all parties to archive digitalisation might rethink or have a more realistic expectation of what's achievable and affordable, useful and desirable. So I'd like to begin by setting the current archival context. So the National Archives, TNA, is a non-ministerial department and the official archive and publisher for UK government and for England and Wales. It gives expert advice in information and records management and fulfills a leadership, inspection and accreditation role for the archive sector. In 2015, TNA was transferred from the Ministry of Justice to the Department for Culture, Media and Sport, and is now very much a cultural heritage as well as a research institution. Recent government policy documentation has reinforced a series of imperatives which govern our business and ambitions. So the 2018 DCMS Culture is Digital report builds on the 2016 Culture White Paper. And these set out the aspiration to make the UK a world leader for digitalised public collections. Cue laughter. Now, government has positioned TNA as a leader within the cultural sector to develop a new strategic approach to the digitalisation and presentation of cultural objects. This includes convening a task force to address strategic barriers to the digitalisation of collections, such as sustainability and economic modelling, and leading on common standards to make assets more interoperable, discoverable and sustainable, and to allow cultural organisations to reach and engage more people than could ever have physical access to culture through visits. So in 2015-16, TNA reported 17 million plus visits to its over 80 million digitised and published online historical documents. Now this has increased annually as more content is added. However, as Julia Late recently discussed while extolling the transformational effects of digitisation on what she termed small history in the modern era, and I quote, "The greatest push has been the digitalisation of what we could characterise as individuated archival records. Birth, marriage and death registrations, the census, immigration and naturalisation records, criminal records, military service records, and other material searchable by name." Now, while colleagues lead on cataloguing projects that enhance descriptions in our online catalogue, and while commercial companies such as Adam Matthew Online provide subscription access to modern domestic, foreign and colonial records, much of our digitised content is now available to researchers via online genealogical providers, Ancestry and Find My Past. Discordant voices, principally but not exclusively academic researchers, have periodically criticised this commercial turn, particularly as research guidance and on-site services are now perceived to be geared towards the genealogical market and the first-time and one-time visitor. So the National Archives is now a destination accredited by Visit England, no less. Now, on the one hand, this turn democratises the archive and connects audiences worldwide with our collections, ensuring that TNA fulfills its public task and keeps it relevant. On the other, it addresses a financial scenario in which since 2015, TNA has received a flat settlement from government, having previously tightened its belt for over a decade, and aims to prevent further job losses through compulsory or voluntary redundancy. And just to give you a little bit of context, about when I joined 5 years ago, there were about 630 colleagues. There's now about 500. Now, straitened budgets are common across the sector, of course, and some of you will have witnessed the protest in 2017 as Northamptonshire Archives tried to restrict and ultimately charge for access to records as the County Council went bankrupt. Now, this has led at TNA to a strategy to monetise the archive, including the unknown and as yet unreadable collections, to which I'll come in a moment. Now, the drive to digitise has become a commercially led exercise in cherry-picking. And importantly, as Lara Putnam's observed, digitalisation is also uneven, temporally speaking. The period before the modern empire and state and its surveillance and record-keeping presents fewer opportunities for the kind of digitalisation that would allow nominal record linkage about individuals, but there's also less investment in such digitalisation projects, not least because they're of less interest to family historians. Now, this effectively means enhanced access to pre-modern collections, which have less immediacy for genealogists and require skill sets beyond even some experienced academics, has been left to the mercies and inconsistencies of competitive research funding or commercial partnerships, which in some cases restrict access to all but wealthy institutions and have uncertain sustainability. Now, this then brings me to the medieval records at TNA, and pre-modern records more generally, the known and unknown. As a successor institution to the Public Record Office, TNA keeps one of the world's great collections. And by medieval, we mean everything from Doomsday to the establishment of the State Paper Office in 1509. Now, TNA houses vast quantities of documents in various formats and states of repair, brought together from repositories across London and elsewhere, created by and for the English Crown. Now, principally, these include those of the main organs of state, so Chancery, Exchequer, the law courts, and private individuals and communities gathered by government in pursuance of legal, political and religious business. Now, to create access, antiquarians, record agents and civil servants have worked tirelessly over several centuries. The Georgian and Victorian Record Commissions published lists, indexes and editions of some of the key series. Following the 1838 Public Records Act and the consequent foundation and opening of the Public Record Office from 1856, the multi-volume calendars of Chancery enrolments, which record an English summary, outgoing royal correspondence and instructions, and the publications of the Pipe Roll Society, editions in Latin of the principal records of financial audit from the 1130s onwards, were among the primary initiatives to improve access to the records. And print publication is, in many quarters, still the preferred option for the record edition. Even now, though, these remain pinpricks into the vastness of TNA's historic archival backlog, which potentially dwarfs the remainder of what is known. And so to illustrate the challenge, I want to explore in more detail precisely what is unread unreadable, and to some extent unknown in the national collection. So in 2017, TNA submitted an application to George Osborne, the Chancellor's LIBOR Fund. Now this aimed for the first time to compile a complete inventory of records of the UK government as part of its public task. So from the 1850s, identification, sorting and listing of public records has been underway. And the volume of documents rapidly became extensive and the related editorial and cataloguing processes more complex. Sorting of some of the more difficult parts of the archive stalled, and over 500 sacks of mostly medieval and early modern material remain sealed, unopened, and now housed at Deep Store, the remote archival store in a former salt mine at Winsford, Cheshire. There are also around 13,000 archive boxes of material that have been preliminarily sifted by vague category, but not formally accessioned, and several hundred more boxes of medieval miscellanea within the Exchequer archive. Now these documents form the last great undiscovered national written collection of public records, and represent, this is an estimate here, around 1 to 2% of the entire holdings of the National Archives. Taken at item or entry level, we might conceivably be talking about millions, perhaps tens of millions. Now the application intended to remove uncertainty over document survival, restore the original arrangement, and allow more precise planning of storage and access arrangements. And this kind of work cannot be undertaken without significant cost in terms of equipment and personnel, and must be undertaken before any exposure to digital technology. Now the records are in unknown states of repair. Many will be coagulated together due to the effects of damp or vermin or insect damage. And this is Henry Cole's rat. It was the rat that was presented to the Record Commission in 1834 as evidence of what were the state of public records. You can now buy a furry version in our bookshop. Please do buy a furry rat. The records will need intensive surveying and remedial decontamination from the collection care team at TNA before being repackaged for access. And in order to establish what they can constitute, document specialists with considerable archival cataloguing and research experience, expertise in medieval and early modern handwriting and requisite language skills in Latin, Anglo-Norman French and Middle English will be required. You all know those skills don't come cheap, machine or no machine. Now the project requested just shy of £1 million for a project to last over 3 years. Now the unknown and unread, therefore, cannot in most cases simply be exposed to machine processing without assertion of intellectual control. And this is a time-consuming and expensive process, as indeed the 2016 Culture White Paper noted. Where public money is involved, a broader programme of work priorities has to be considered, whether the unknown sources are of perceived interest or not. Now suffice to say, I wouldn't be standing here if it did, but the LIBOR application was unsuccessful. Perhaps as government felt such essential work should be business as usual. Now internally too, there is the view that everything is now done and it just needs to be exploited. The impression we have is that much of this collection is legal in character, consisting of bundles of very formulaic writs from the central law courts, local assizes and judicial heirs. And there's a couple of examples of our recent sort. Paleography test on these at the end, by the way. Gold dust, this is not. Even if we cannot be sure what exciting finds might lurk in unopened sacks. Now, if government's unwilling to fund such core archival discovery and funding councils expressly will not fund resource enhancement projects, how can the unknown and the unread be made accessible? Now, there's also a worrying trend that the key interpretive skills required to provide continued access to pre-modern records are in decline within the archival community. The half dozen or so archival schools within the UK certainly provide training in Latin and paleography, but the curriculum is necessarily diverse to cover all bases from appraisal, records management, digital preservation, cataloguing standards and protocols, through to advocacy and outreach. Graduates are therefore largely not equipped to cope confidently when faced with medieval collections, and some courses now do not even teach paleography back beyond the Civil War. Now, it's not impossible that within a generation, many archives with medieval holdings will not employ an archivist with the requisite interpretive skills. Now, this is already the case in my home county of Lincolnshire, where local authority restructuring and budget cuts have slashed the archive staff to 2 and have left internationally important antiquarian, episcopal, estate and manorial collections in stasis. My collaboration with the University of Lincoln and TNA to fund doctorates to catalogue key manorial collections is kind of an innovative and encouraging development. But de-skilling is not simply being witnessed among professionals. Postgraduate linguistic and paleographic experience outside their own niche is difficult to gather, particularly as postdoctoral opportunities are fewer now than perhaps a decade ago. Master's training in many UK universities, while often of a high quality, is not of sufficient duration or intensity, for quite obvious reasons, to equip researchers with the breadth of knowledge they might plausibly require as academics or heritage professionals. And this has, I think, an important consequence. So the appetite for interpreted, edited content online will only grow. Banks of images and machine protest text scratch that itch, but don't fully serve the audience, as it can take researchers away from the originals, neglect the development of some of the key practical skills of interpretation, and actually what people really need, particularly in the public domain, is translated text, not just transcribed text. Now equally, the growth of digital research content often has a tendency to decontextualise and rob the viewer of vital interpretive information. And it's some of these challenges which, I've probably not got much time, but I'll turn now. So, those of you familiar will recognise this. So this is our archive catalogue. TNA's had an online presence since about 2000. Since then, various iterations of the website have displayed only a small number of images alongside catalogue data, usually as downloads. We don't even currently have like any kind of AAAF program, anything like no image repository. We've got an image library, but all the images there you have to pay for. Now, there's been some pay-per-view digitalisation, as with the Wills of the Prerogative Court of Canterbury in our Prob 11 series, but the images were taken from microfilm, and new itemised descriptions for individual testator's added for the upload introduced errors in personal and place names that aren't present in the paper lists. Now, in the past 20 years, TNA has, however, collaborated on various Research Council-funded academic projects that have, in the best examples, paired digital images with edited text and research content. So I'm thinking of things like the SCA Ancient Petitions Project, which opened up around 16,000 medieval parliamentary petitions, the Fine Rolls Project, which I mentioned a moment ago, the Gascon Rolls Project, which is an addition to the rolls of the English administration in southwest France, and both the Parliament Rolls of Medieval England and the Tudor Chamber Books projects. Now, these projects, of course, have brought much that was unread to full public view at no upfront charge. Now, they achieve a great deal in opening up the medieval collections to academic scrutiny and to an interested public. The media attention some of these projects have received continues to keep the pre-modern collections in the eyes of our directors and demonstrates its value outside of a narrow research community. Now, an important takeaway here, then, is that access to key parts of the medieval government archive is now in the hands of external parties. Now, despite funding councils requiring robust data management and sustainability plans, we're now approaching a critical moment. Projects of around a decade's vintage are becoming ossified or imperilled altogether as digital humanities centres change priorities and cannot commit funds to continued maintenance of legacy sites. So TNA also currently expresses little interest in retrieving and or representing such complex metadata, some of which now exist simultaneously in print formats, and will not commit resources to long-term preservation of and access to data extracted from its collections in the way that the now defunct Arts and Humanities Data Service used to. Much of the descriptive data that comprises these online editions is open source and therefore recoverable, as is now the case with the English Monastic Archives project, which I've gone past now again. Now, the project website and data were lost for about 2 years earlier this decade, but the data, if not the public interface, is now downloadable in a series of XML sheets, so that has been saved. Generally, the presentation of data and the curation of images produced by many pioneering digital projects is not guaranteed. There are also further questions over intellectual property and copyright in the longer term. The danger is that we're creating cathedrals of research imagery and content, but we're not taking sufficient steps to make sure they last. Now, perhaps as seriously in the context of the National Archives, the initial commercial drive to digitise name-rich modern records affected a decision which, with hindsight, appears short-sighted and runs counter to the transformative potential digital tools have for accessing pre-modern records. So, about a dozen years ago, the National Archives licensed the University of Houston's Anglo-American Legal Tradition Project to photograph and upload to its website a wide selection of unpublished legal and financial records in its pre-modern collections. By August 2015, this had reached 9.25 million frames of historical material. For those of us not party to the original discussions, as I wasn't, but who worked with the consequences, this has created somewhat of a dichotomy. Vast image banks such as these are unquestionably useful for experienced researchers, remote from the archive, and are much admired by them. Indeed, this site has undoubtedly exposed some serious and new scrutiny. So from the comfort of his own office, in Cluj in Romania, Professor David Smith, former keeper of the Borthwick Institute in York, has recently published a supplement to his 3-volume inventory of the heads of religious houses, England and Wales 940 to 1540, which adds thousands of new references to his seminal monastic prosopography from the unpublished plea rolls of the courts of King's Bench and Common Pleas. And similarly, it would be churlish of me not to recognise that for research students on limited budgets, the ability to undertake significant portions of their research on original records without visiting the archive is a crucial saving and an incentive to remain in postgraduate study. Conversely, AALT has a handful of quite serious flaws. Now, you can't see here, but have a look for yourself. The image quality isn't great, too many images are out of focus, cut off important numbering or text, or display information personal to the photographers. Images also betray poor handling of originals that reflect badly on TNA. The images presented on the site may not, although this is yet to be proven, I'm not sure whether it's true or not, have a high enough resolution or be regular enough to be exposed to things like AAAF or handwritten text recognition. That's for other people to try. There's also no metadata, as Will was talking about earlier. Now, the quick and dirty approach also produced a presentation of individual documents that separates face from DORS, where the rotulate numbers are quite often cropped out, and this means that it's tricky and more time-consuming than it should be to navigate a case that's written on both sides of one or more rotulates. More egregiously still, referencing is almost non-existent, which means that it can be trying for inexperienced researchers to track down entries of interest. And it's frankly revealing that TNA gave no warranty as to the accuracy, completeness, or fitness for purpose of the information provided. Now, the problem, of course, is that this partnership, if I'm being generous, has to some extent mortgaged the future of medieval collections at TNA. Peer reviewers might look sceptically on research bids that include expensive digitalisation elements when images of relevant records are already freely accessible online and have been for decades. And that might therefore limit the scope of collaboration. It's yet to be proven either way, and certainly our licensing managers have encouraged us to explore various opportunities. But the horse may already have bolted. Okay, so I don't want to obviously tar all digitalisation projects with the same brush, and I had some nice sort of positive things to end on. What I will say is that National Archives now is the culture is changing, and obviously we're very open to collaboration. We want you to use our stuff, and we want you to use it in the way that suits you. So, for example, I've recently been talking to some historical linguists in medieval French, and they want access to our collection for Anglo-Norman dictionary, various code shifting things, that kind of stuff. I'm just going to run through. I'll find a couple of things. So just to give you a couple of examples. Is anybody aware of the Beyond 2022 project? So this is a project run out of the Adapt Centre at Trinity College Dublin. It aims to intellectually and virtually reconstruct the Public Record Office of Ireland on the day of its bombing and destruction in 1922. Part of what they're doing is what they're calling an Exchequer Gold Seam, which is using the medieval records of the Irish Exchequer, which was submitted for audit to Westminster, which we have, to reconstruct the Exchequer Archive of Ireland to item level. It's a fantastic collaboration which we're involved in, and we're hoping to do things that Toby's talking about, data linking. We're hoping to do, all the images are going to be AAAF. It's going to be hopefully amazing. On seals, and I should say now John's here. Guess who's the currently nominated seal specialist at TNA? Oh dear, yes, I didn't stand back when everybody else did. But one of the things John didn't talk about, but I will, is that we have a collection of 7,500 sealed moulds, and we're just currently finishing off a project to digitise those and make them available with all the metadata there, all the images there. But what's actually happening is the digital image is what's going to be accessioned, not the original mould. The original moulds aren't actually public records, but the accessioned moulds will be. And actually they preserve, as John will know, some examples of seals where we don't have an impression for. And then finally, I want to, any of you with research students who might want to use TNA collections, I'd just like to alert you to our postgraduate archival skills training, currently known as PAST, cunningly known as PAST. So because we constantly were meeting students on the inquiry desk who were coming to us and saying, well, what have you got on this? Or it was clear that their PhD supervisors hadn't given them any guidance which would lead them to the right areas, and they'd started here and hadn't known about that. We came up with like a 3-stage program of archival skills training. So we've got like an introductory day, which is just a basic introduction to the archives. Then we have skills and methodology workshops, which are more sort of tailored to medievalists, early modernists, modern, domestic modern, and we've got like a design one now. And then we have finally records workshops. So like the records workshop, for example, we do a full day on TNA's medieval legal collections. And the idea is that students who work possibly outside of that field might come to us, find out what we have, because I mean, many of you will know, for example, like the archive of the Court of Common Pleas is incredibly rich. There's lots of information in it that just isn't out there. I will finish now on that hopefully slightly brighter note, but thanks anyway.